Thank you again for joining me during these live internet studies. My name is Arlo Ben Lyman Hanavi. This is an hour-and-a-half long study broken into two segments. The first segment is, as you can see on your screen, entitled Eschatology, a Biblical Study of End-Time Events. The second study, which begins after an hour, which I hope you can stick around for the entire study, is a Trinitarian response to biblical Unitarianism. So let's jump into Eschatology, a Biblical Study of End-Time Events. As we look at my schedule that you can see on the screen right now, we are working through this topical index of subjects, and we worked our way through topics 1 through 4, and we're in now topic 5, Book of Daniel, the 70 weeks of Daniel. And we're drawing this topical section to a close. We're going to be dealing with summary and conclusions tonight. We're going to be looking directly at the 70th week of Daniel, not just the overview of the 70 weeks, but now we're zeroing in on that last final 7-year stretch that, according to the futurist perspective, is still yet future, right? So as we're looking at this topic, we're actually building momentum as we work our way towards actually the book of Revelation. You can see down on my screen here on the topical list, I've updated this just a day or two ago to include not only a new topic, but just remind you that topic 14 and 15 is the book of Revelation study. And this really is a book of Revelation study. It's an eschatology study, yes, but the main thrust of where I'm going is we're working our way towards the study on the book of Revelation, which is going to take a lot longer when we finally get to it, because we're going to go somewhat verse by verse, somewhat topic by topic when we get to the book of Revelation. But until we get there, we're at topic 5 with Book of Daniel, and I added a new topic to the list. Topic 6, Excursus Antichrist, according to Robert Van Kampen. Recall from earlier studies that I introduced this late Christian author, and his name was Robert Van Kampen, and he wrote a really, really helpful book on eschatology known as The Sign, and it's available at Amazon. I'll put a little screenshot in the post-production for you so you can see what I'm talking about, what the book looks like, the cover looks like, etc. Great book. I don't agree with everything that the author presents, but I found that enough of the foundational truths to be solidly grounded in scripture from my perspective that I can endorse the book, and I've had the book for several years. I've gone through it a few different times, and so basically what I'm going to do eventually, probably not next week and probably not even the week after, because it'll take maybe this week, next week, and possibly the third week to finish up the summary and conclusion of the 70 weeks of Daniel. But what we'll do is I'll turn and we'll pull a portion of one of the chapters out of his book, The Sign, and it's dealing with the Antichrist specifically. So just thought I'd make you aware of that. All right, I'm going to try a different format tonight, so I hope you guys can run with me. I'm going to start using a PowerPoint slide to see if this will help me stay on topic, stop and kind of prevent me from rambling so much and chasing rabbit holes and rabbis, and see if this will also make it easier for you guys to understand where I'm going, since a lot of what I'm going to say is already put together in earlier this week. So I put together this PowerPoint, and we're just going to work our way through these particular slides. So the first thing I want to do before we jump into the study itself, last week we left off, let me turn over to, here we go. Last week we left off with Pastor David Guzik's study online for the book of Daniel, particularly Daniel 9, 24 through 27. And at the very end of his study, he had this little kind of an excursus itself, footnoted section at the very bottom of his study called The 70 Weeks of Daniel as Understood by Sir Robert Anderson in The Coming Prince. And I said I would look at that very, very briefly. I'm not going to take very long on this. Really, I'm just going to read it verbatim because we've already studied most of this, and then I'll jump right into my own PowerPoint slide. But he basically talks about how that Daniel 9, 24 to 25 talks about the decree to rebuild Jerusalem to the coming Messiah. And the point for Guzik bringing this to our attention is because, as you probably know, or you may not know, a good chunk or portion or segment of Judaism that rejects Jesus as the candidate for Messiah does so based on their differing understanding of the timing of Daniel's prophecies. Christianity, for the most part, even if you factor in the contrasting perspectives of futurist versus preterist positions, nevertheless, both groups represent a Christian position when it comes to Jesus is the one that Daniel was prophesying about. There are some minority positions within Christianity that say, no, this isn't Jesus. Kind of a oxymoron, moronic position myself. Kind of, how can you say contradiction, right? Paradox. How can you say you're a Christian group, but yet you reject Jesus in Daniel? Oh, well, anyway, it happens. But Guzik's purpose for bringing this little chart down at the very, very bottom is so that he can understand where the timing is centered, where the foundational aspects of it. And Sir Robert Anderson is kind of the one who provided the seminal work that has recently, well, I shouldn't say recently, but it has since been verified, checked, and updated, modified, and corrected in some areas by other individuals, so as to make it a little bit more accurate. But the gist of it still stands. It says withstood the tests of time, but he shows how that the 7 plus 62 weeks equals 69 groups of 7 years. Thus, we end up with 483 years. Anderson understood a prophetic year as 360 days, which is based on ancient history, etc., as well as based on scriptural analysis. Therefore, there's an X amount of days, and if we then chart this and calculate it against ancient history and the Bible using the decree of Artaxerxes, and you can see the dates on your screen there, then we end up having a date that allows us to pinpoint the 483 years as culminating in Yeshua himself hitting the scene in the first century, starting his ministry during a certain time frame. Anderson believed that Jesus celebrated 4 Passovers during his ministry, etc., etc. We see some of this. I'm just kind of quickly alerting you to it. I'm not going to read through all of it since it's not particularly foundational to what I'm teaching here in the book, in this eschatological study. Although I do believe that Sir Robert Anderson's calculations were very, very helpful. I may have some slight differences in the way I understand the calculations go, but the overall gist is the same. In other words, we do, whether or not the calculation is 100% accurate or not, we accept that Yeshua came according to scripture, according to prophecy, and he performed his Father's works and commandments according to what timetable God knew should happen. And I believe that Daniel was speaking of that. So I am on board with that. So I want you guys not to misunderstand. I want you to know that from my understanding as a Christian, as a Messianic Jewish man, I accept that Yeshua is the one that Daniel spoke of. This is contrary to Rabbinic Judaism, National Israel's position today that says this is not Jesus because the calculations are all Christian miscalculations, etc., etc. So therefore, the key figures are wrong, blah, blah, blah. And so you can see this on your screen. There's some adjustments, etc., etc. This is the more popular position that's held by many in Christianity, and you're going to hear this taught and pushed across many, many pulpits the world over. So I thought I'd make you aware of that in case you want to know where some of that information comes from. Pastor Guzik provides that at the very bottom of his commentary, okay? All right. Having said that, let's jump back over into my own commentary and my own slideshow presentation. So let's jump from the topical presentation and jump into just real quick as well as we're forming our summary and conclusions to what we've been talking about. It's necessary for me one more time, and I say one more time, but in reality, I'm going to do it more often, a few more times down the road to let you become aware, make you aware of the two somewhat almost polar opposite positions on end time prophecy, eschatology. There's the preterist view, which is the position that I do not subscribe to. Remember, preterism comes in two flavors. It comes in what we might call a full or hyper preterism, more very strict preterism, which is borderline heresy, and in fact probably is heretical. At least it's been labeled heretical from the other version of preterism. But the full preterist / hyper preterism has serious flaws in scriptural interpretation. The other version of preterism, which is a little bit more liberal, a little bit more, and it's certainly more popular within Christianity, is known as partial preterism, or it also goes by the name of orthodox preterism. So when we speak of preterism from a non-preteristic perspective, we non-preterists usually simply just say preterists. We don't usually have to define full versus partial. But the preterist view, this approach holds that the prophecies of Revelation were fulfilled in AD 70 when Titus and his Roman army overran Jerusalem and destroyed the Jewish temple. So in this scheme, the book of Revelation does not deal with the future. And as I mentioned, one of the problems with this view is that Revelation claims to be prophecy, right? We know that from reading Revelation. Further, multiple events described in the book of Revelation bear no resemblance to the events of AD 70. For example, a third of mankind was not killed as predicted in Revelation 9, 18, etc., etc. So, moreover, substantive evidence indicates that the book of Revelation was written about AD 95, long after the destruction of Jerusalem. In fact, that last little sentence there at the bottom, where it talks about the date of the writing of Revelation, that is actually the central point that undergirds the preterist perspective that says that everything took place before 70 AD or up to 70 AD, and once the temple was destroyed, Judaism was destroyed, the Jewish people were set aside, and a new covenant began with the Gentile people and the birth of the church and the establishment of Christianity. And so preterism, even in its partial versions, forms what we might know as one of the more dangerous versions of replacement theology, supersessionism, where the church replaces Israel as the people of God, the New Testament replaces the Old Testament as the scriptures of God, and Christianity replaces Judaism as the religion of God and religion that's prominent in God's plans, etc., etc. So preterism has some beliefs that I, as a Messianic Jew, simply cannot endorse. I absolutely cannot endorse them. Not only because they run counter to my own personal understanding of Scripture, right? Covenant theology versus remnant theology, et cetera, but the the ideals and belief system that preterism supports and champions seem to run contrary to what I find in the Bible itself. So that's the preterist view. And if indeed the date of Revelation can be absolutely established to be in the 90s, well, then preterism, whether you're full or partial, preterism as a system crumbles, because preterism cannot stand if something existed after 70 AD that resembles Judaism or Christianity or something like that. I'm sorry, Judaism or Torah observance, etc., etc. All right, the preterist timeline looks like this, real quick. This is just a refresher. This is humorous. This image that you're looking at right now is actually borrowed from the Jehovah's Witnesses. Yes, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the JWs, they are preterists. At least the ones that I've studied are. The ones that I've researched are. And so, according to their perspective, we can see that Daniel's 490 years, or the 70 weeks of Daniel, start sometime in 455 BC, or sometime around the same starting point that many Christians hold to. I myself think that the late 450s is a great starting point. Either that or the mid 440s. Either one. There's only a 10 to a dozen years difference between the two starting days, so it's not that crucial to me. But notice that the preterists start around the same date, but they conclude around the year 30 AD with the events in Messiah Yeshua's life, him arriving, him being cut off, and the end of the 70 weeks, and then that's it. Nothing more happens after that, according to the preterist perspective. By contrast, the futurist view, which is the view that I myself hold to and the view that I'm going to be teaching during these eschatology studies, because that's the one I believe has the most, that makes the most sense of Scripture taking in its literal, normal, historical, grammatical fashion. It doesn't try to allegorize or spiritualize Scriptures. It accounts for what we might call the genre that we're studying, right? Apocalyptic literature, poetic in form, mysterious, kind of cryptic. Okay, it allows for all those. So there are symbols involved with this type of study, but nevertheless, when I say literal, the Bible was meant to be understood, the language that it was written in, and it was meant to be understood by the people who read it so that, when you read through the book of Revelation, it's self-explanatory. You don't have to push your idea into it like eisegesis. You simply just extrapolate the information using logical deduction and expository teaching, and therefore you exegete, you take out of it. The futurist view is that position, and I believe that's the best position to arrive at myself. Although this is not a salvific discussion, whether you're a preterist or futurist or somewhere in between, idealist, eclecticist, or historicist, or any of the other four or five positions that are available out there. That part doesn't matter. The position that you arrive at simply influences your understanding of prophecy, but it should not directly impact your salvation experience, and it shouldn't impact your relationship to God per se. Extremes notwithstanding. So the futurist view, the futurist approach to interpreting the book of Revelation, holds that most of the events described in the book will take place in the end times, just prior to the second coming of Christ. This is the view that honors the book's claim to be prophecy. It also recognizes that just as the Old Testament prophecies of the first coming of Christ were fulfilled literally, more than 100 of them, by the way, so the prophecies of the second coming and the events that will lead up to it will be fulfilled literally. So that's the position we're going to be teaching during this particular study. So sit back and relax. Let me read through the slides. Most of it is self-explanatory, so I shouldn't have to ramble as much. I'll just flip through the slides and we'll begin our study that way. First, what I want to do is I want us to summarize Daniel's prophecies using charts and graphs and images like I've popularly been doing. Okay, so we'll start with images and graphs, and then we'll work our way towards written commentary. You ready? Here we go. Daniel's 70 weeks summary and conclusions. So we've got this first chart. It shows the 70th week of Daniel. It shows all of the major players according to the chart. This, by the way, is a more or less a chart that harmonizes between whether you're pre-trib, pre-wrath, post-trib, mid-trib. For the most part, it has harmony in most of those circles. What's really visually important about this particular graph is that it breaks Daniel's 490 years into the three sections that Daniel himself uses. The first section of 49 years, followed by the next section of 434 years, followed by a gap, followed by the last section of 7 years. And you can see all the major details on there in this particular slide. We've been using this predominantly throughout our slideshows and throughout this particular study. We've got another chart here that begins to zoom in on what we established reading through Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7, bringing us into Daniel chapter 9 and following. And that is the idea that Daniel was shown the future using a few different dreams. There was Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the statue with the four metals on the left side of your chart, followed by Daniel's own personal dream of the four beasts on the right side of the chart. And we can see the one-to-one correlation between what those dreams mean. They were both the same meaning from God's perspective, just two different tools or vehicles to be delivered to the human agents. So the gold represented Babylon, which represents a lion, or was symbolized by a lion, which represents Babylon itself from 2 to 7. I'm reading from left to right on the chart. Silver was the Medo-Persian Empire, which was represented by the bear, which of course is the kingdom of Medo-Persia in the four beasts. Bronze was Greece, the leopard. Iron was Rome, the fourth beast. And then, as we're going to see tonight, we're going to see that the bottom of the statue corresponds directly in the iron and clay with the 10 kingdoms, which equal the 10 horns and the 10 kingdoms of Daniel chapter 7. That's what we're going to be zeroing in on, is the 70th week of Daniel has to deal with this final stage of human history as it deals with Israel and the Gentile church, the Gentile peoples who've been grafted into Israel. How is God going to finalize all that he promised would take place in various parts of the Bible? Like we're going to see here in a moment, how that Daniel was told that these 6 things pertain to you, Israel, and your people in Jerusalem. But as we know in hindsight now, it's going to actually impact the church as well.